The air still tasted of cordite and fear, a bitter aftertaste that clung to Sergeant Miller's tongue long after the last enemy fire had faded into the dense jungle. His platoon, or what was left of it, a ragged collection of 17-year-old privates with wide, haunted eyes and veterans whose faces were maps of old battles, had just stumbled out of a brutal ambush near the Ia Drang Valley. They'd walked into it blind, a tripwire pulled by unseen hands, and the jungle had exploded into a cacophony of AK-47 fire, screaming, and the sickening thud of incoming grenades. Miller had seen worse, but the memory of Private Jones, a fresh-faced kid from Ohio, bleeding out silently with a bewildered look on his face, was a fresh wound. They had managed to break contact, leaving behind 3 dead and 2 wounded, and now they huddled in a temporary secure zone, the silence of the jungle pressing down on them, almost as heavy as the earlier barrage. Exhaustion was a physical entity, draped over every man like a shroud, but the adrenaline still hummed beneath their skin, a discordant symphony of raw nerves. Davies, a greenhorn who'd arrived just last week, was meticulously cleaning his M16, though it was spotless. His hands trembled, a telltale sign of the shock slowly setting in. Doc Riley, a medic whose calm demeanor belied the horrors he witnessed daily, moved between the men, offering a canteen, a word of solace, or a small, white pill. He saw the same question in their eyes. What now? The answer came sooner than expected. A crackle on the field radio, almost a whisper in the oppressive quiet, brought Captain Hayes' voice. "Sergeant Miller, you copy?" Miller keyed his mic, "Copy, Captain," loud and clear. Hayes' voice was tight, strained. "Listen up, Miller. We've got a situation. Firebase Phoenix. Comms went dark 2 days ago. Recon flew over, nothing. No signs of fight, no distress calls, just gone. We need eyes on the ground. Your platoon's the closest. Get moving. Northwest, grid reference Charlie Tango 05. Secure the firebase. Assess the situation, report back. And Miller? Be careful. This doesn't feel right." The orders hung in the air, heavy and unwelcome. Firebase Phoenix. Deep in contested territory, a lone outpost carved out of the jungle, notoriously isolated. The idea of an entire firebase simply vanishing without a trace sent a chill down Miller's spine, far colder than the jungle night. "Understood, Captain," Miller replied, his voice betraying none of the dread coiling in his gut. He looked at his men, at Davies' still, trembling hands, at the weary faces of the veterans. They were battered, physically and emotionally, yet here they were, being asked to walk into another unknown. The silence from Captain Hayes after the orders was perhaps the most unsettling part. No further instructions, no words of encouragement, just the dead air, echoing the strange emptiness of Firebase Phoenix. Miller knew what he had to do, but the uncanny nature of the mission, the absolute lack of information beyond gone, made the weight on his shoulders feel like a concrete slab. He sighed, the sound lost in the vastness of the jungle, and began issuing orders. Each word a stone dropped into a bottomless well of uncertainty. The dread, deep and profound, was a premonition he couldn't shake. This wasn't just another patrol. This felt like an invitation to something far more insidious than a direct firefight. The jungle swallowed them whole, its emerald canopy a suffocating lid over their advance. Every step was a battle against the thick undergrowth, the clinging vines, and the unseen inhabitants that rustled just beyond their sight. Following the compass heading towards Firebase Phoenix, the platoon moved with a heightened sense of vigilance born from their recent ambush. But instead of the usual symphony of buzzing insects, distant bird calls, and the occasional chatter of monkeys, an unnatural silence had descended. It wasn't absolute, but it was profoundly unsettling, a muted, almost reverent quiet that made the skin prickle. Davies, walking point behind Miller, constantly scanned the dense foliage, his M16 held at the ready, sweat beading on his brow despite the relative coolness beneath the triple canopy. He jumped at the sudden snap of a twig under his boot, whipping around with a gasp before Miller placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Easy, son," Miller murmured, his voice low. Just jungle. But even Miller felt the tension coiling in his own chest. This silence was different. It wasn't the silence of an empty jungle. It was the silence of something holding its breath, waiting. They found subtle signs, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, that confirmed the captain's intel. They were deep in contested territory. A barely disturbed patch of flattened grass, too precise to be natural, hinted at a recent encampment. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of wood smoke, long dissipated, hung briefly in the humid air. A single, discarded cigarette, but distinctly non-American, lay partially buried in the muddy trail, a ghost of a presence. Yet, despite these clues, there was no actual presence. No tribvidis, no bo habitraps, no você patros. It was as if the enemy had moved through, leaving only whispers in their wake, and then vanished, allowing the silence to reclaim its domain. This absence of immediate threat, the uncanny quiet after the previous day's chaos, was almost more terrifying than the ambush itself. It allowed the mind to wander, to conjure up scenarios far worse than a direct confrontation. The veteran soldiers, usually stoic, exchanged uneasy glances. They were accustomed to the jungle's cacophony, its constant hum of life and death. This oppressive stillness was alien, a predator's lull. Doc Riley, usually focused on his immediate surroundings, kept glancing up, scanning the canopy, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at his hip. Miller walked with his senses stretched taut, every nerve ending screaming a warning that remained frustratingly unfulfilled. He saw the doubt, the fear, slowly eroding the composure of his men, particularly the younger ones. He barked orders, kept them moving, tried to project an air of confidence he didn't feel. He knew what a prolonged period of this kind of psychological pressure could do to a man. It wasn't a visible enemy they were fighting now, but an insidious one, creeping into their minds, distorting their perceptions. The deeper they plunged into the quiet green labyrinth, the heavier the silence became, pressing in on them from all sides. It felt like walking into a trap with open eyes, but unable to see the snare. The air grew thicker, hotter, and the anticipation of what lay ahead, or what didn't, was a palpable weight on their shoulders. The jungle wasn't just a place anymore. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was watching them, waiting for them to break, just like Firebase Phoenix had waited, abandoned and silent, for their arrival. The first hint of Firebase Phoenix was not a clearing, nor a watchtower, but a faint, almost imperceptible hum in the air, the kind of resonance that suggested dormant machinery. Then, through a final dense screen of foliage, they broke into the perimeter. Miller expected a ravaged landscape, perhaps smoking ruins, or at the very least, signs of a desperate struggle. Instead, Firebase Phoenix presented itself as an eerily pristine ghost town. The perimeter barbed wire was intact, the sandbag bunkers stood sentinel, and a few jeeps sat parked, coated in a fine layer of dust, but otherwise undamaged. The main living quarters, a series of corrugated tin shacks, were all present and accounted for. Yet, no one was there, not a single soul. The silence inside the wire was absolute, a stark contrast to the buzzing insects they'd temporarily left behind in the jungle's embrace. It was the silence of a place suddenly, inexplicably abandoned. Miller raised a hand, bringing the patrol to a halt. His eyes scanned every inch, looking for the tripwire. The ambush he felt was inevitable. But there was nothing. Spread out, he ordered, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet. Form a perimeter. Weapons up. Davies, wide-eyed, fumbled with his rifle, his fear palpable. The men moved cautiously, their boots crunching on the gravel path, each sound amplified in the oppressive quiet. They approached the shacks. Inside the first, a makeshift mess hall, plates of half-eaten rations sat on tables, plastic spoons still resting in the half-finished meals. A deck of cards lay fanned out on one table, mid-game. A half-written letter, its ink slightly smudged, was pinned to a bulletin board. It was as if life had simply paused, mid-sentence, and then evaporated. There were no bloodstains, no bullet holes, no signs of forced entry. It defied all logic, all their understanding of how a military outpost was overrun. Doc Riley, usually unflappable, ran a hand over a dusty chessboard, where a game was meticulously set up but left unfinished. His brow furrowed in confusion. "This is impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where are they?" Miller felt a cold dread seep into his bones, far worse than any firefight. A firefight, however brutal, had a clear enemy, a tangible threat. This was an enigma, a vacuum that sucked all sense of reason into it. They checked the bunkers, the comm shack, the infirmary. Everything was in order, untouched, yet deserted. The radio equipment was powered down, not damaged. The medical supplies neatly arranged. The barracks were empty, beds made, personal effects still on footlockers, a paperback novel, a dog tag, a family photo. It was a snapshot of normal life, suddenly frozen in time. Sergeant Miller knew the enemy often used psychological warfare, but this was on another level. This wasn't a tactic designed to instill fear in the enemy. It was designed to make them question reality itself. He called in their findings to Captain Hayes, his voice tight. "Captain, we're at Firebase Phoenix. It's deserted. No signs of a struggle. Equipment's here, personal effects. It's like they just vanished." A long pause on the other end. "Vanished? Miller, what the hell are you talking about?" "Sir, I'm telling you, it's a ghost town. Food on the tables, games in progress. No bodies, no blood. Nothing." Another pause, then Hayes' voice strained. "Stay put, Miller. Establish defensive positions. I'm sending a chopper out to you at first light. Don't touch anything. Just hold tight." The order to hold tight, to simply wait in this silent, abandoned place, was a torment in itself. Miller felt watched, an invisible pair of eyes scrutinizing their every move. The lack of an enemy, the unsettling quiet, was more terrifying than the fiercest barrage. It was a void, waiting to be filled, and Miller knew, with chilling certainty, that whatever had filled it before had not been good. Night descended upon Firebase Phoenix like a shroud woven from shadows and oppressive quiet. The silence intensified with the darkness, no longer just unnerving, but actively hostile. Every creak of the abandoned buildings, every rustle of dry leaves caught in a phantom breeze, became an event, amplified tenfold in the men's hyper-alert minds. Miller had positioned his men in the existing sandbag bunkers, reinforcing their positions, but he knew the true battle was unfolding within their heads. The psychological warfare had begun in earnest. Davies, assigned to a bunker overlooking the southern perimeter, was a coiled spring of raw nerves. Miller found him staring intensely into the inky blackness, his M16 pointed at nothing. "See something, Davies?" Miller whispered, his own senses stretched thin. Davies flinched, startled, then shook his head, his eyes wide. "No, Sergeant. I thought I heard something." "What did you hear?" "I don't know, sir. Like someone moving. Barely a whisper, but it was there." Miller listened. The only sound was the frantic thumping of his own heart and the distant, almost imagined hum of the generator that powered nothing. He knew the jungle played tricks on the mind at night, making shadows dance and whispers emerge from the wind. But in this place, this ghost town, those tricks felt more real, more malicious. He moved through the perimeter, checking on his men. Specialist Thompson, a usually jovial Texan, sat slumped against the sandbags, his eyes closed, muttering to himself. Miller nudged him gently. "Thompson, you all right?" Thompson's eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. "They're here, Sarge. I know they're here. They're just watching us. Waiting." Doc Riley was huddled in the makeshift infirmary, examining a map by the dim glow of a red-filtered flashlight. He looked up as Miller entered, his face etched with worry. "Sergeant, the men are on edge. More than usual. The lack of contact, this emptiness, it's getting to them. I've had to hand out a few more tranquilizers than I'd like." "Any theories, Doc?" Miller asked, rubbing the back of his neck, feeling the tension knotting his muscles. Riley sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Psychologically, this is a perfect storm. Uncertainty, isolation, an unnatural environment. The mind abhors a vacuum, Sergeant. It fills it with the worst possibilities. In this place, it feels like it's designed to exploit that. Miller knew Riley was right. He felt it too, the insidious creep of paranoia, the sense of being an insect under a magnifying glass. He imagined invisible eyes peering from the darkness of the jungle, from the shadows of the empty shacks. Were they being watched? Had the previous occupants simply evaporated, or had they been taken? Was this a trap, meticulously laid, designed not for a sudden assault, but for a slow, agonizing mental breakdown? He thought of the half-eaten meals, the unfinished card game. It wasn't a hasty retreat. It was an instant, surgical removal. But by whom and why? He returned to his own bunker, taking up position behind the M60, his finger resting near the trigger. Every distant insect chirp, every rustle of leaves, every imagined sound became a potential threat. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find a shred of sanity, but the images of Jones bleeding out, of Davies' trembling hands, of the abandoned firebase, haunted him. The silence was a hammer, slowly, deliberately, pounding on the anvil of his mind. Sleep was an impossible luxury. He watched the darkness, and the darkness watched back, waiting for him to break. Days bled into one another, indistinguishable except for the increasing pallor of the men's faces and the deepening lines of exhaustion etched around their eyes. The promised chopper never materialized, presumably grounded by weather or other, more pressing, engagements. So they remained, trapped in the oppressive embrace of Firebase Phoenix. The initial hyper-alertness had given way to a mind-numbing boredom, punctuated by bursts of irrational fear. The silence, once merely unsettling, had become a living entity, an oppressive weight that smothered conversation and amplified every minor irritation. Rations were dwindling, and patrols into the immediate surrounding jungle yielded nothing but more of the same unnerving quiet. The men grew restless, irritable. Small arguments flared over trivial things. A misplaced lighter, a snoring bunkmate, quickly extinguished by Miller's stern presence, but leaving behind lingering resentment. Davies, the greenhorn, had regressed. He spoke less, often found staring vacantly at the abandoned walls, occasionally flinching at nothing. Miller caught him one afternoon, sketching intricate, swirling patterns in the dirt with a stick, his eyes unfocused. "What are you doing, Davies?" Miller asked, his voice softer than usual. Davies looked up, startled, then quickly wiped away the drawing. "Nothing, Sergeant. Just thinking." "About what?" Davies hesitated, then confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "About them. The guys who were here. What happened? How could they just disappear? Did they see something? Did they feel it coming?" The questions hung in the air, unanswerable, echoing Miller's own gnawing uncertainties. Even the hardened veterans were showing signs of strain. Specialist Gibson, usually a stoic man who had seen multiple tours, began to talk in his sleep, his dreams filled with fragmented shouts and distant echoes. Doc Riley, who had taken to pacing the perimeter, reported an increase in psychosomatic complaints: headaches, stomach aches, unexplainable tremors. "It's the anticipation, Sergeant," Riley explained one evening, his voice weary. "The human mind can adapt to acute trauma, to sustained combat even. But this waiting for something that never comes, the uncertainty of an invisible enemy, it's a slow poison. Their minds are fabricating threats to fill the void, creating monsters in the shadows because the truth is too incomprehensible." Miller understood. He felt the insidious creep himself. Every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every distant jungle sound morphed into a hidden movement. He found himself meticulously checking and rechecking his M16, polishing it until it gleamed, a meaningless ritual that momentarily offered a semblance of control in a situation utterly devoid of it. He began to notice strange, almost imperceptible details within the deserted firebase. Faint carvings on the wooden walls of the barracks, almost too shallow to see in the dim light. They looked like crude symbols, perhaps the initials of previous occupants, or something more ancient, tribal. One symbol in particular, a jagged, broken circle, appeared repeatedly, almost like a warning. He tried to dismiss it as idle vandalism, but the consistency of its appearance unsettled him. He felt the place itself was exerting a pressure, a silent, psychological attack. The absence of an enemy was not peace. It was a deeper, more profound kind of warfare. The question wasn't if something would happen, but when and what form it would take. The waiting had become the enemy, a relentless, mind-numbing torture that slowly chipped away at their sanity, leaving them vulnerable, exposed, and utterly exhausted long before any shot was fired. They were not fighting for survival yet. They were fighting for their minds against the insidious creep of the unknown. One stifling afternoon, amidst the monotonous routine of perimeter checks and silent patrols, Specialist Hoot Gibson, the platoon's designated tunnel rat, due to his lean build and uncanny sense of direction, stumbled upon something significant. He was inspecting a particularly dense section of bamboo and tangled vines along the western perimeter, an area the previous occupants might have used as a makeshift latrine, when he noticed an anomaly. A section of the earth was too smooth, too flat, almost expertly concealed. He knelt, pushing aside the vegetation, and felt for inconsistencies. His fingers brushed against something hard and metallic, a camouflage trapdoor. Sergeant Miller. His voice, normally quiet, carried a rare urgency. Miller, observing from a nearby bunker, immediately moved towards him, his hand already on his pistol. Davies, looking lethargic, slowly raised his head. "What is it, Hoot?" Miller asked, kneeling beside him. Hoot scraped away more dirt and leaves, revealing the faint outline of a square hatch, crudely fashioned but effective in its concealment. A rusty metal handle was barely visible. "Found something, Sergeant. Feels like an entrance. Might be a tunnel." A ripple of unease, mixed with a strange sense of vindication, passed through the small group. This was the first concrete clue, the first tangible explanation for the Firebase's eerie desertion, or at least a potential part of it. The VC were renowned for their intricate tunnel systems, subterranean labyrinths that allowed them to appear and disappear like ghosts. Could an entire Firebase have been evacuated or captured through such a network? Miller considered his options. Captain Hayes' orders were to hold tight and not touch anything. But this discovery changed everything. It was a direct lead, a potential explanation, and a possible solution to the agonizing uncertainty. Leaving it unexplored felt like a dereliction of duty and a further erosion of their already fragile morale. The lure of understanding what had happened, of finding some closure to the torturous waiting, was powerful. He looked at Hoot, whose eyes were alight with a professional curiosity that temporarily eclipsed the surrounding dread. "Can you open it, Hoot?" Carefully, Hoot nodded, producing a small pry bar from his pack. With a grunt, he levered the hatch open. A gust of stale, earthy air, thick with the scent of damp soil and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling, wafted out. Below, a dark, narrow shaft plunged into the earth. The silence, previously exterior, now felt like it was emanating from the very ground beneath them. "It goes deep, Sarge," Hoot muttered, peering into the gloom. "Looks like a proper network, not just a simple escape route." Miller made his decision. "All right, Hoot, you and me. Davies, you'll be our cover man up top. Keep your eyes peeled, and if you hear anything, anything dash, you let us know. Doc, stay with Davies. Everyone else, maintain perimeter vigilance." Davies swallowed hard, his face blanching. The thought of descending into that black maw, into the unknown depths of the earth, was clearly terrifying him. But Miller knew this was their best, perhaps only, chance at breaking the maddening cycle of waiting. The tunnel represented a potential confrontation, a tangible enemy, which ironically felt almost like a relief after weeks of fighting shadows. This was a new layer of the psychological game, a descent into the literal and metaphorical abyss. The ground beneath their feet, once a static foundation for their torture, now presented a living, breathing, and terrifying secret. The descent into the tunnel system was a plunge into another dimension, a suffocating embrace of darkness and dread. Hoot, leading the way, moved with the fluid expertise of a seasoned tunnel rat, his helmet light cutting a narrow beam through the inky blackness. Miller followed, M16 held tight, his breath catching in his throat, while Davies, pale and trembling, maintained a cautious distance near the entrance, acting as their fragile tether to the world above. The air in the tunnel was thick, humid, and heavy with the smell of damp earth, mold, and something else, something faintly acrid like stale sweat and fear. The walls, roughly hewn, pressed in on them, triggering an immediate, visceral wave of claustrophobia. Miller, usually unyielding, felt his heart pound against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the Earth's silent oppression. The beam of Hoot's light danced across the tunnel walls, revealing crude markings, symbols eerily similar to the jagged, broken circles Miller had observed upstairs. They seemed to multiply, appearing with increasing frequency, etched into the mud or scratched onto wooden supports. They were unsettling, ancient, and undeniably deliberate. As they moved deeper, the whispers began. At first, Miller dismissed them as the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears, or the subtle creaks of the earth settling. But then Hoot paused, his head cocked, his light sweeping the dark corners. "Did you hear that, Sarge?" he whispered, his voice unervingly low. Miller strained his ears. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like voices murmuring just beyond the reach of hearing, seemed to echo through the subterranean passages. It was indistinct, formless, yet undeniably present. Davies, still near the entrance, yelled down, his voice trembling, "Sergeant, I hear something. What is that? Stay alert, Davies." Miller called back, his own voice tight with suppressed fear. The whispers grew, or perhaps their minds were simply amplifying them. They weren't distinct words, but a cacophony of soft, sibilant sounds, like a multitude of unseen entities breathing just beyond their comprehension. The terror wasn't just physical claustrophobia. It was the psychological dread of the unknown, of being surrounded by an invisible presence within the suffocating earth. They found evidence of extensive use. Empty rice sacks, discarded bamboo water canteens, even a makeshift cooking area with a lingering smell of burnt charcoal. This wasn't just a simple bolt hole. It was an active, well-maintained network, a hidden world beneath their feet. They even found what looked like a command post, a small alcove with a crude map drawn on the wall, showing not only the firebase above, but also surrounding jungle trails and a disconcerting array of symbols that made no sense to Miller. The implications were chilling. The VC hadn't just used this tunnel. They had lived in it, operated from it, perhaps even observed the firebase from its hidden depths. The whispers seemed to intensify here, a spectral chorus of unseen voices. Davies above ground was now calling out more frantically. "Sergeant, something's moving up here. I can feel it." Miller felt a sudden, sharp coldness prickle his skin. The whispers, the markings, the oppressive atmosphere. It all coalesced into a profound sense of wrongness. They were in a place where the enemy had not merely hidden, but thrived, watching them, studying them. And now, they were deep inside the enemy's lair, vulnerable and exposed. "Hoot, we're pulling out. Now!" Miller commanded, turning, pushing the fear aside, replacing it with a surge of adrenaline. The silence of Firebase Phoenix had been a lie, a carefully constructed illusion. The true terror had always been beneath their feet, patiently waiting, observing, and now perhaps awakening. As Hoot, Miller, and a visibly shaken Davies scrambled out of the tunnel system, blinking against the muted afternoon light, the firebase perimeter erupted. The waiting was over. It wasn't a gradual build-up, no warning shots, no distant cries. It was an instantaneous explosion of chaos and violence. The oppressive silence that had plagued Firebase Phoenix for weeks shattered into 1,000 shards of sound. The sharp crack of AK-47s, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of machine guns, the terrifying whistle and boom of incoming mortar rounds. Contact! Contact! Multiple directions. Doc Riley's voice, usually calm, was hoarse with panic, echoing from the sandbagged infirmary. Men were yelling, returning fire, but they were caught flat-footed. The VC, having observed their patterns, knowing about the tunnel entrance, had launched a coordinated assault from every angle, including the very tunnel mouth from which Hoot, Miller, and Davies had just emerged. Miller saw a flash of movement at the tree line, dark figures charging, bayonets glinting. Another group, emerging from the tall grass, seemed to materialize from nowhere, firing indiscriminately. And then, terrifyingly, he saw them. More VC swarming out of other, previously unnoticed tunnel exits within the firebase itself, turning their own fortified positions against them. Ambush! We're surrounded, Miller screamed, shoving Davies towards cover behind a supply crate, his M16 spitting fire at an advancing enemy soldier. The sheer speed and coordination of the assault confirmed Miller's chilling realization. The lull hadn't been an absence of enemy. It had been a deliberate, psychological attack designed to lull them into a false sense of security, to fray their nerves, to soften them up. The firebase wasn't abandoned. It had been a meticulously prepared trap, a stage for a final, devastating act. He saw Thompson, the jovial Texan, go down, clutching his chest, a bewildered look on his face. Doc Riley, despite the hail of bullets, was already crawling towards him, his medical bag clutched tight. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the air, painting lethal lines of red and green. Grenades exploded with deafening force, sending shrapnel whistling through the air, tearing through sandbags and tin shacks. The familiar smell of cordite mixed with the acrid scent of burning foliage, and something else, something metallic and sickening, the smell of fresh blood. Davies, initially frozen with terror, now moved with a raw, primal instinct. He emptied a magazine into a charging VC soldier, the force of the combat jolting him into a horrifying clarity. He wasn't just a greenhorn anymore. He was fighting for his life, propelled by the weeks of agonizing uncertainty and the sudden, brutal reality of close-quarters combat. Miller, manning the M60, laid down a suppressive fire, his mind a whirlwind of tactical decisions and desperate prayers. He saw his men fighting valiantly, but they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, victims of a strategy that transcended conventional warfare. The enemy had used time, silence, and the fear of the unknown as their primary weapons, chipping away at their resolve day by agonizing day. Now, they were paying the price for that prolonged torture. Every shot fired, every grenade thrown, every desperate cry for help was a testament to the fact that the waiting, the mind-numbing lull had been the true enemy all along, a silent, insidious killer that had primed them for this bloody, brutal climax. The firefight raged, a maelstrom of sound and fury that swallowed the firebase whole. Miller, still behind the M60, his face grimed with sweat and powder, laid down a constant stream of fire, forcing the VC to break their charges. But they kept coming, relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. The close-quarters combat was brutal, visceral. Knives flashed in the dim light of explosions, rifle but connected with sickening thuds. The firebase, once a symbol of empty dread, had transformed into a crucible of desperate survival. Davies, no longer the trembling greenhorn, had found a grim determination. He was low on ammunition, his rifle hot to the touch, but he fought with a ferocity Miller hadn't seen in him before. He had taken cover behind a shattered jeep, reloading frantically, his eyes scanning for targets, every movement precise, lethal. He was no longer just fighting for his life. He was fighting for a sanity that had been tested to its breaking point during the long, silent weeks. Incoming, Doc Riley screamed, his voice strained as he dragged a wounded private behind a crumbling wall. A mortar round slammed into the calm shack, reducing it to splinters, sending a shower of debris over their positions. Miller felt the concussive force, his ears ringing, but he kept firing, shouting orders, trying to rally his dwindling force. They were losing ground, slowly but surely. The VC were exploiting every weakness, every vulnerability, especially the tunnel exits they now controlled. It was clear their weeks of silent observation had given them a profound understanding of the Firebase's layout and its defenders' mental state. Miller saw a group of VC attempting to breach the main barracks, their forms illuminated by the burning remains of a supply tent. He swung the M60, raking the area, watching them fall. But for every one that went down, another seemed to rise, emerging from the shadows, from the earth itself. The casualties were mounting. Specialist Thompson was dead, Riley confirmed, his voice heavy with grief. Private Jenkins, a quiet kid who loved to read, lay bleeding from a leg wound, screaming in agony. Riley, moving with incredible courage under fire, was doing his best, but he was overwhelmed. The memory of the agonizing waiting, the insidious fear, fueled Miller's fury. This wasn't just a battle, it was a reckoning. The VC hadn't just attacked their positions, they had attacked their minds, their very souls, with the torment of the lull. And now, they were trying to finish the job. He screamed, a primal roar that cut through the din of battle, pouring every ounce of his frustration and rage into the M60, emptying another belt into the charging enemy. The air was thick with smoke and dust, the ground slick with blood. The Firebase was a charnel house, a testament to the brutal cost of the psychological warfare waged against them. They were fighting not just the enemy in front of them, but the ghosts of their own fears, the lingering echoes of the mind-numbing torture that had led them to this moment. They were fighting for their very existence, battered, broken, but refusing to yield, drawing strength from the very depths of their prolonged suffering. Slowly, painstakingly, the tide began to turn. The sheer desperation of Miller's men, their backs against the wall, ignited a fierce, almost suicidal resolve. They fought with a primal fury, fueled by grief and the lingering trauma of the prolonged waiting. Miller, leading from the front, seemed to be everywhere, inspiring, directing, killing. Davies, hardened by the brutal reality, became a disciplined killer, his fear transmuted into lethal focus. Doc Riley, tending to the wounded under relentless fire, embodied courageous resilience. After what felt like an eternity, the intensity of the VC assault began to wane. The waves of attackers thinned, their charges less coordinated, less fervent. The sun, a blood-orange disk through the smoke and dust, began its descent, casting long, eerie shadows across the devastated Firebase. Finally, after what felt like hours, the last VC forms melted back into the jungle, their retreat signaled by a fading volley of small arms fire. The silence that followed was not the oppressive, anticipatory quiet of the past weeks, but a deafening hush, the profound silence of exhaustion and grief. Miller slowly rose from behind the M60, his muscles screaming in protest. The Firebase was ravaged. Shacks smoldered, sandbags were torn open, and craters pocked the ground like fresh wounds. The air hung thick with the stench of cordite, burning debris, and the metallic tang of blood. He surveyed the scene, his eyes scanning the bodies of his fallen men, their faces peaceful now, freed from the torment of the lull. Davies sat slumped against a shattered wall, his M16 across his lap, his eyes fixed on nothing, his face smeared with dirt and streaks of tears. He was alive, but irrevocably changed. The greenhorn was gone, replaced by a ghost of a man who had stared into the abyss and fought his way back. Doc Riley moved among the wounded, his movements slow, heavy, the exhaustion finally catching up to him. He shook his head grimly as Miller approached, confirming another casualty. Private Jenkins, the quiet reader, had succumbed to his wounds. "We held, Sergeant," Riley said, his voice a raw whisper. "But at what cost?" Miller looked out into the deepening twilight, towards the impenetrable jungle that had birthed and then swallowed the enemy. The victory fell hollow, bought with too much blood and too much sanity. The Firebase, once a symbol of empty dread, was now a monument to their sacrifice. He understood it then, with a chilling clarity that settled deep into his bones. The true terror wasn't always the firefight itself, the visible enemy, the immediate threat. No, the true terror was the insidious, mind-numbing torture of waiting for it. The weeks of silent observation, the psychological torment, the deliberate erosion of their minds that had been the real war. The VC hadn't just intended to overrun them. They had intended to break them first, to make the eventual combat a mere formality. The lull, the agonizing wait, had been a weapon more potent than any AK-47, leaving scars deeper than any bullet wound, wounds that would fester in their minds long after the physical ones had healed. He thought of the half-eaten meals, the unfinished card game, the cryptic markings. They weren't just abandoned, they were bait. Bait for their minds, for their fears. Miller placed a hand on Davy's shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity and shared trauma. They had survived the fire, but the echoes of the silence would haunt them forever. The war wasn't just fought with bullets and bombs. It was fought in the dark, silent chambers of the mind, a battle where the longest, most painful casualties were often taken long before the first shot was even fired. The night that followed the battle was strangely serene, the silence a stark contrast to the preceding hours of carnage. Yet it was a silence thick with the scent of death and the profound weight of exhaustion. Miller's remaining men, battered and bruised, moved like ghosts, tending to the wounded and securing what little was left of Firebase Phoenix. There were no more enemy contacts, just the quiet, mournful rustle of the jungle reclaiming its dominion. The promised medevac choppers arrived just before dawn, their rotor wash stirring the dust and debris, a welcome but mournful sound. The wounded were evacuated, and with them, the bodies of the fallen. Each departing chopper carried away not just physical casualties, but also pieces of the men who remained. Miller watched them go, a hollow ache in his chest. He saw Doc Riley, his face etched with unspeakable weariness, climb aboard one of the birds, turning back only to nod solemnly at Miller, a shared acknowledgement of the horrors they had endured. Davies, clutching his M16, stared at the departing choppers, his eyes still wide, but now with a chilling emptiness. Miller knew the boy would never be the same. The greenhorn who'd arrived just weeks ago had been obliterated, replaced by a hardened, traumatized shell. The psychological wounds of the lull had festered, and the brutal firefight had simply ripped them open, leaving permanent scars. Later, as the first rays of the sun painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and weary orange, Captain Hayes arrived with a small reinforcement squad. He surveyed the devastation, his face grim. "My God, Miller, what happened here?" Miller looked around the ruined firebase, at the still, smoldering shacks, the bullet-riddled sandbags, the fresh craters. "They waited, Captain. That's what happened. They made us wait. They watched us, wore us down. The firebase was a trap, designed to break our minds before they broke our lines." Hayes looked at him, a flicker of understanding and then horror in his eyes. "So, the silence, the abandoned base, it was all part of it." Miller nodded. "The most brutal part, sir. We were fighting the emptiness, the paranoia. We were fighting ourselves long before they fired a single shot." The captain remained silent for a long moment, taking in the full scope of Miller's words, the profound psychological cost. He knew the jungle, knew the enemy, but this level of insidious warfare was something else entirely. It was a new frontier of terror. Miller then led Hayes to the discovered tunnel entrance, explaining the intricate network they had found. "They were living under our feet, sir, watching every move, waiting for us to crack." Hayes knelt, peering into the dark maw of the tunnel, a shiver running down his spine despite the growing heat of the day. He understood now. The lull wasn't passive. It was active. It was an extended psychological operation that had delivered a devastating blow before the physical battle even began. The true horror of Firebase Phoenix wasn't its sudden abandonment, but its deliberate, calculated silence. As the cleanup began, and the sounds of heavy equipment slowly replaced the silence of grief, Miller watched Davies, who was now mechanically helping to clear debris, his movements robotic. The boy would carry the echoes of that lull, the whispers in the dark, the fear of the unknown, for the rest of his life. The scars of the waiting, Miller knew, were deeper and more insidious than any bullet wound. They were the invisible wounds of a war waged not just on the battlefield, but within the fragile confines of the human mind, leaving an indelible mark that time would struggle to erase.